Hey everyone, I'm Andrey and I'm product design lead here at Beamery. And for the past year and a half, I've been working on Team Core frontend to help drive the design system. And this talk will be about how we managed to deliver the design system despite all the whirlwinds that has been happening around, and how we managed to stay effective at pace. But before I begin, I want to start with a little personal story. Around 2016 or so, when I just began working on design systems, was really inspired by industry leaders like Shopify or Atlassian, who have already published their systems. And they published a lot of great articles with stories about how they developed their systems, real success stories. Was really inspired by all that. And a lot of water has passed under the bridge since then. I had led the design systems at Intercom and VK.com, supported many more as external consultant. I also launched my online course on design systems. And yet, every day of my experience was drastically different to those articles with success stories. Most of the time, I was fighting for resource. And as a result, I had to wear a lot of hats simultaneously and juggle multiple roles. I had to fight for engagement. And overall, I had to move much faster than I would want to. Regardless, I was really inspired by the idea that I would want to build the world-class design system that can sit aside the likes of Shopify. And with that, I embarked on one of the design system projects. It was several years ago. We, as a team, were very devoted to do everything by the book. And usually when you start working on a system from scratch, when there was no system before, you want to be a little bit more on a strict side because you need to build a certain culture first. And therefore, we decided that we would want to really centralize the ownership of the system, own and track every pattern across, and also be very strict about deviations because we want to incentivize consistency. But with time, we found out that things aren't going as expected. Instead of speeding everyone up, our design system does sort of the opposite. And with time, this makes designers and engineers more and more relaxed to use it. When we tried to analyze what had happened, we understood that in our ambition to build these world-class design systems, we didn't take into account the unique circumstances of that particular company and tangibly its size, pace, and culture. In terms of size, it was growing scale up with more than 600 people. And that means that overall pace of development was very fast. And as a result, instead of encouraging consistency, they were encouraging experimentation. And in this reality, our strict system was only creating roadblocks for everyone. And back then, I thought that it's the company's mentality that has to change. They need to embrace this culture of consistency. But in fact, it's my mentality that had to change. I should have taken into account and empathized with the existing ways of working in that company. This would have made the overall development of the system much more effective. Now we fast forward to 2021 when we started working on the Beamery's design system. And usually when you start working on design system, things are not necessarily in a perfect order. This happens with every single company. So you would probably have some legacy that limits product development. You would have design and tech debt that limits and slows down designers and engineers. You would also have painful experience for designers and engineers. And we had all that, just like every other company. But at the same time, we had a few of the challenges of our own. In particular, we didn't have any foundations to rely on when we just began. So we had to take a step back and develop the overall visual language for our system even before we can start working on it. We also were under the time pressure, as it usually happens in B2B enterprise sector. So we had no luxury of investing a lot of time into that. Also, as a team, we experienced some turnover, which obviously slowed us down. So when I look at all that constraints, in hindsight, I realized that they were also kind of a blessing. As a few of the previous speakers mentioned, when you are really constrained, sometimes it could really inspire you and make you more creative. And this is what happened with us. It forced us to be more pragmatic in our approach and really think hard where and how we would invest our time and efforts in order to maximize the impact. It also meant that we would most likely deviate from some golden standards or do things even completely differently. So this is a story of giving up some mental models and acquiring new ones. When you begin redesigning your products with design systems, there are several potential options. It could be a big bang redesign, which frankly a lot of companies try to avoid, or it could be a redesign product by product, or even page by page. But regardless of these approaches, it usually implies that you have to sit as a team, if there is a design system team or a number of individuals, and chip away components one by one until you finally get to this like 1.0 release. And all that time, and this is what I've been doing myself, by the way, in previous companies, but all that means that all the time before this 1.0 release, your team would be a complete black box for everyone else. Your company wouldn't get any value from your work until then. And this is something that we cannot afford. So in order to avoid that situation, we decided that instead of just sitting and building the design system in complete isolation, we will develop in the context of a real product launch. What this means is that this will allow us to first implement it straight away, to have like a forcing function from time, and also validate our system immediately. So we needed to choose the appropriate project to start with. And we evaluated potential options through different lenses. First, it's urgency. Since it's the first implementation, we didn't want to rush it way too much, but still it has to be timely. It has to have impact. So by the end, ideally, we would develop enough components to cover a lot of use cases and overall have a multiplicative effect all across the company. We need to think carefully about the product in terms of its scope, in terms of how much it could affect other products around it, because when you're redesigning one product, it could have like a domino effect. Therefore, we didn't want to break any metric. So the product itself must be really encapsulated in a way, but still usable. And effort. Obviously, we don't want to overwhelm ourselves at the very beginning. And when we evaluated number of projects based on these criteria, we chose pools list. It was very timely, and it allowed us to build all the necessary components, including the table, which is a thing of its own. It's really huge, but at the same time, the majority of Beamery is various kinds of tables. So this will give us a really great impact all across the company. So this is great. But first, you need to develop the foundational building blocks. And this is when I had to break another mental model. If you wake up designer in the middle of the night, they will likely be able to explain Double Diamond to you. So you're going through certain discovery phases before you actually begin developing something. And this is what we do at Beamery all the time, but not this time. We knew from the scope of the pulls list which components we need to build. We also had rough designs for them because we spent some time developing the overall visual language. What we didn't have is proper research for all these components, so we only had designs. And in a standard situation, a typical situation which I've been before in, engineers will just sit and wait for you to conduct all the necessary research and hand over the necessary data to them, the specs. But again, this is something that we cannot afford. We cannot afford blocking ourselves. And we decided to do things in parallel. So I will conduct the due diligence of discovery and rationalization, whilst engineers will lay out all the technical scaffolding, and they will even build the components before I deliver the specs to them. In order to do that, we utilize the concept of headless components. In particular, we used React Spectrum libraries. What that is that gives you all the technical foundations for your components, including state management, accessibility, everything that you need to begin. And then you can put a layer of UI on top of that. So this is great. This is not limiting us anymore. So this approach allowed us to avoid waterfall and make quick progress as a result, and overall have really strong components. But at the same time, such a lean and a little bit backwards approach meant that there will be another part of the design system that will do completely differently. And I'm talking about documentation. If you look at this definition of the design system by Nathan Curtis, documentation is essentially like an intrinsic part that makes the design system what it is. And if you think about design system documentation, you can imagine this website from Shopify or Atlassian, these industry leaders. They have custom websites for their documentation. And in fact, I've been approaching this so far myself. For example, this is documentation website that we built for Intercom. And this means that such approach means that for every component, you will not only create just a custom web page, but create long form documentation with lots of examples, do's and don'ts and whatnot. But now, and we would like to do that, to be honest. But now I'm putting my pragmatic hat on and asking, in order to unblock engineers and designers, do I really need a custom website? Or it could be something simpler. Do I really need a documentation page with lots of examples for every single component? When we start thinking about that, we realized that we might think of a documentation not as a one-off thing where you have nothing and then you have to build all of this scope, but you can think of it as a process where layer by layer, you will deliver the right amount of documentation that you need right now, eventually getting to a place where you have this shiny custom website, but starting with some MVP solution that will allow your consumers to essentially use the system. Another principle that we utilized was predictability. We used that for technical documentation. This means that we craft the API of our components in such a way that it would meet the mental model of our consumers. It will do exactly what they expect from it. This is where we had to rely on industry standards, by the way. And this also means that we'll try to ingrain the documentation and in their existing workflows. So essentially, documentation will meet them where they already are. And in particular, for example, we utilize these code hints. So you would, and an engineer, while writing the code, they would get contextual suggestions and pieces of documentation, and you don't need to write the whole page for it. And lastly, for design documentation, we heavily utilize third-party tools. When I just began working on design systems several years ago, there was no a lot of choice. If you want to write documentation, you need to either build a custom website or you will use something much more generic like Confluence, for example. Now there is plenty of choice and you have a lot of opportunity to speed up your process. In particular, we used Zero Height. I really love this product. This is not an advertisement, but yeah, I really love it because this allowed us to implement everything that we need for design documentation at this point in time with very little effort. We also used Loom for to creating some of the guidelines. So instead of writing long form pages for some of the guides that we needed, we created this short, engaging videos that are really easy to make and then to maintain if necessary. But this is just another form that allows us to move much faster. So I walked you through how we the steps that we took in order to stay effective at pace. But was it all worthwhile? And if we would evaluate the results tangibly in a reasonably low span of time, we were able to unblock 2 teams to implement the system in their products. We also delivered a critical mass of components that would allow us to cover a lot of use cases, enable future implementations. And as a result of it, the 3rd team has just used the design system, even without our active support, which also kind of validates their approach for documentation. Overall, 3 of the 5 front-end teams have already consumed the system, and I think this is a great validation of the whole approach. This is great proof of concept for the system. And we overall laid all the foundations for now that we can settle a little bit, slow down our approach, and get ready for what would be the next chapter for Beamery's design system. Lastly, I just wanted to share a few learnings. When you look at various documentation, various design systems, you may think that all of them are like roughly the same. At the same time, they're drastically different. And what makes them different is the fact that every company is different. And therefore, when you're developing the design system for your company, instead of optimizing for some golden standards and best practices, make sure that you also optimize for the unique circumstances of that particular company. Start small and move incrementally. This has been the essence of our approach. And this doesn't mean that we will cut the corners and ship some scrappy stuff. We would never sacrifice the quality. We can only sacrifice the scope. And in order to achieve that, we always start with thinking big. We'll create a vision for where we want to be. Next, we would develop a strategy, like a path towards that vision. And then we will take the first step that will allow us to have impact. Thank you very much for watching. It was really great to finally be able to do that here.